comes to following orders
I am seeing your next
You are-
slide.
for him.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you're right, it's not. I don't know if I'm still, I guess I'm still sharing, huh?
Yep, you're doing good. Thank you.
Cool. Hopefully that works now. So on the right is a map of the global protected areas. And you can see, if you look at the two maps together, that there's not a lot of overlap between the areas of the greatest biodiversity that's under threat and the areas that are protected. And so increasingly, we're seeing places where the highest levels of biodiversity overlap with areas of intensive human use. And now I'm in the presenter view again. Sorry. So, for example, this was taken in India, where cranes are overlapping with agricultural regions. If you know the International Crane Foundation up in Baraboo, they're working on projects there on exactly this issue of social ecological systems. So what do I mean when I say social ecological systems? That term refers to, in this case, having some kind of conservation interest, in this case, specific species. We're going to take these cranes for a minute as the example. And the conservation of that species depends on an ecological component, which is the things in the ecosystem that they need to survive being intact and functioning in the way that they need them to. And then also that ecological component is affected by a human use component. So the human use needs to be compatible with the ecological needs of a species for that species to be able to be conserved in that system. And the system, I'm going to use the system of shade coffee agroforestry, where I did my research, as an example of a social ecological system today and how we can think about evaluating the conservation value of that system. So I worked in northern Nicaragua in a number of different shade coffee farms. Shade coffee is a really interesting ecological or agricultural system because there are a couple of characteristics that make it kind of unique. One is that coffee, as a plant, is native to forest understories. So it grows actually pretty well, and in some cases even better if it's underneath a little bit of shade. That allows farmers to have the option of planting trees in the coffee farms. Trees have a lot of biodiversity benefits, everything from birds and insects to plants that I'll be talking about today. Another interesting thing about the coffee system is that coffee is grown at mid-elevations in the tropics, and generally that's on very steep and uneven terrain. So it's not really possible to mechanically farm coffee in most regions where it's grown, which means that it's heavily dependent on human labor, and the human component of that system is really intricately entwined in the agriculture. And so there are large farms that hire workers, but there are also a huge number of small family-owned farms where the family is doing all of the labor. This map shows the regions where coffee is grown around the world, and the darker green colors are higher levels of production. So Nicaragua, where I worked, is here, so pretty high coffee growing region. And then I'm going to overlay that map of the biodiversity hotspots again. And so watch one area of the map and see where it ends up. Just go back. So a lot of coffee growing regions are in biodiversity hotspots. So how coffee is grown then has a lot of implications for biodiversity conservation. And as I said, there are a range of practices that can be used in growing coffee that allow everything from open sun-grown coffee, which isn't even pictured here, which is just like a coffee monoculture, all the way up to a very diversified system with large shade trees that are growing, that are maybe even producing other crops from the trees or other useful products from the trees. So there's a lot of ways to do this, to set this up. And I'm going to look at this system with my biodiversity variable of interest being vascular epiphytes. And we're going to look at the tree habitat that those epiphytes need, and then the management practices that inform that. So what are vascular epiphytes? A lot of us here in the northern country know these best as houseplants. So a lot of these are orchids, bromeliads, many different species of ferns, peperomias, aroids are all in this category of vascular epiphytes. Epiphyte comes from the Greek epi, meaning upon, phyton, meaning plant. These are plants that grow on other plants, in this case on trees. So these are plants that are not rooted in the ground. They're actually growing on the branches or on the trunk of trees, and they get all of their nutrients from decomposition that happens in the canopy and from rainfall coming down the tree. These are the major groups that I looked at in this study: orchids, bromeliads, and ferns. And then I had another category, which included mainly peperomias and aroids, and a couple of other groups. And these species function as ecological keystones. So they provide habitat for things like frogs. Bromeliads have pools of water in them, and frogs will actually lay eggs in those pools of water. Birds use epiphytes as food resources directly through berries that are produced on the plants, as foraging substrate for insects that they're eating, because the insects are attracted to the plants. And then insects, particularly, like, for example, with orchids, there are very tight plant pollinator relationships that have evolved over long periods of time that are very specific to those species. So in some cases, there's one species of wasp that pollinates one species of orchid. And so very kind of precarious in terms of thinking about threats to those species. And epiphytes can grow throughout the whole tree. And going from the bottom of the tree to the top of the tree, you have a large range of environmental conditions. So light and temperature tend to increase as you get towards the outer branches of the tree, while humidity tends to increase as you get closer to the bottom of the tree in the shadier understory parts of the forest. And those different habitats are attractive to different species of epiphytes. So this is a bromeliad that grows out on the outer branch tips of the tree. And then this is a begonia, actually, that grows very close to the ground on the trunk of the tree. And these plants have really different characteristics. And so in the outer branches, we're seeing some of these drought tolerating traits across the species. So those are, for example, this tank form that is what the frogs use with bromeliads, where the plant is actually capturing and storing rainwater, and then it will absorb that rainwater over time in between rain events to give itself enough water. There are also specialized structures called trichomes on the leaves of some of the plants that will absorb water from humidity or fog in the air. And then there's orchids particularly have specialized water storage structures. They have modified stems called pseudobulbs, where they can store large amounts of water and go through months, really, some of them, without having any new water input. And then a lot of species also have succulent leaves, which is another way to store water. Some of them also avoid drought, so they go, meaning that they go dormant during the driest parts of the year. So some orchids are, and a couple of ferns also are drought deciduous. So they lose all of their leaves during the dry season. And then when it starts raining again, they put out a new flush of leaves, similar to what our trees do here. And then there's what's called poikilohydry, which basically means that they just desiccate down to nothing. They lose all of their moisture. And then when it rains again, they'll pop back open and start photosynthesizing. It's really pretty amazing, but there's a few species of ferns that do that. And then I'm not really going to talk about mosses today, but mosses do that as well. And then in the lower part of the forest, you have plants that have more drought intolerant traits. So these species have thinner leaves. They tend to have larger leaves because they're in the shade and they're trying to capture as much light as they can. And they are very tolerant of being in the shade, but they're not tolerant of drying out. So we're going to look at 3 parts of this shade coffee epiphyte system today. I'm going to start out talking about the community ecology, so the diversity of species, where they are in the trees, and how they get there over time. And then we're going to look at what's going on physiologically with these plants in terms of the traits that they have that I just talked about with drought tolerance, and how those relate to the environmental conditions. And then we'll talk about the people component. So what's going on with the farmers and the decisions that they make and how that affects the conservation value of these farms. And so let's start out here with the community ecology. This is my set of study sites. So all of the pink flags are different farms that I went to, and then I focused more extensive work at the 2 farms that are in white circles. And just to know, for those 2, the one at the top of the screen is much more humid and wet and cooler than the one at the bottom of the screen. So I'll be comparing those 2 in terms of their environmental conditions. And we're in the north central part of Nicaragua in the highlands. So I climbed some trees to access these plants. I have an 8-foot long slingshot that I used to get the rope up there. And then I also surveyed smaller trees from the ground using binoculars. And the 30 farms that I visited were across a spectrum of management complexity. And when I say management complexity, I'm talking about a few different things. First, tree size, so how big in diameter these trees are, tree diversity, how many species of trees there are, and then the canopy cover, so the amount of shade that the trees are casting over the coffee plants. In these pictures, we have coffee in the understory in all of the photos. And then, so going from left to right here, I would say that this is a continuum in management complexity, with the photo on the photo on the left being the least complex, small trees, not a lot of canopy cover, and low tree diversity, which you probably can't tell from the photo, but there's only 1 or 2 species of tree in that planting. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have a farm that's very older, very well established, has very large trees, many different species of shade tree, and they're casting quite a lot of shade on those coffee plants. So I used that the spectrum of tree diameter as a surrogate for time to look at how epiphytes arrive in these trees, how they colonize these trees that are in the coffee farms. So I found that trees didn't really accumulate epiphytes at all until they were about 12 centimeters in diameter. And that's about 3 or 4 years of growth in that area of the world, and for those particular types of trees. And then after those first 3 or 4 years, then they started to accumulate some of the epiphyte species. And I started finding more and more species there as those trees got larger, up to about 40 centimeters, which would be maybe a 15-year-old tree, something like that. And then after that, the number of epiphytes just accelerated. And I found no evidence that steep increase with diameter ever stopped. So what's happening is that as trees get larger, there's more complex habitat available in them. There's more space on the barks and on the bark and on the branches, but then there's also more habitat complexity where you're getting that cooler environment along the trunk, and then more shade in the inner part of the canopy, and then the outer part of the canopy is really exposed to bright light and wind. And so it can host more different kinds of species. So this idea of what species live where and why is really central to the study of community ecology. And we can think about it as having a regional species pool, which is all of the species that are in a region. And then there are a series of filters that each species must pass through to be able to exist at a given site, in this case, in a given tree. And the first of those is dispersal limitation. So whether the seeds or the propagules can get to the location. So I looked at that using my data, and I split the trees into two groups. I took trees that were smaller than 15 centimeters, so young, small trees. And I looked at them, the small trees that were in stands with older trees versus small trees that were in stands with just each other. And I found that small trees with that were in all small tree stands had a very low probability of hosting epiphytes because the propagules had to come from outside of the farm. But on the other hand, the probability of having epiphytes if you're a small tree that's growing next to a large tree that's full of epiphytes is much higher. So having these mixed age stands is valuable for conservation and allows the young trees to actually become conservation sites for epiphytes quicker. The next filter that I looked at is the abiotic environment. So what are the environmental conditions, the temperature, humidity, all of that, and how does that affect which species are there? And so for this, I compared the two farms that I pointed out on the map. The one that is cooler and wetter and then is in the blue, and then the brown and yellow is the one that's hotter and drier. And at each farm, both of these farms are large, they have ecotourist operations, and they also have preserved forest as part of the property. So I compared trees in the coffee farm to trees of similar size in the preserved forest. And this is what's called a species accumulation curve. Basically, it's the number of epiphytes that I encountered and then the number that were a new species out of those. So as you survey more and more, you find more species, but that rate starts to slow down, and that's where the curve levels off. So where the curve levels off is the total number of species in that location. So what you can take away from this is that the cooler and wetter site had more epiphytes overall, more epiphyte species overall than the hotter, drier site. But also within the sites, interestingly, the forest had more epiphytes than the trees in the forest had more epiphytes than the trees in the coffee farm, but not that much more. There were only a little bit more specios than the trees in the coffee farm. And that's great. That's wonderful to see, because that means that the large trees in the coffee farm are doing a really good job of being habitat for these plants. And then finally, I looked at biotic interactions. And so interactions among species. And in this case, I looked at associations with non-vascular epiphytes. So these would be bryophytes, mosses, and lichens that grow on the trunks of the trees. And what I found is that overall, most of the vascular epiphytes were strongly associated with mosses, with bryophytes, especially the orchids and ferns and some of the group that I called other. Whereas there were a few of the orchid species and then a lot of bromeliads that were more strongly associated with lichen or even with bare bark. Those were the ones that were the first colonizers of the young trees that can take the really intense exposure, and also the ones that grow on the outer branch tips. So putting this all together, I used a model that allows me to look at the strength of relationships between a bunch of variables. And so you'll see blue arrows in this denote positive relationships, red arrows denote negative relationships, and then the width of the line is how strong that relationship is. So moss cover on the tree has a strong positive relationship on the number of epiphyte species that are present. And then looking at stand characteristics, I looked at tree diversity and tree size. And so tree diversity positively influences the number of epiphyte species, as does tree size, and tree size also has a relationship with moss cover. So probably a similar process where the moss is accumulating on larger trees over time. And then I looked at climate variables. I used temperature and insolation, which is the amount of sunlight the site is getting. And I found that both of those had very weak or non-existent relationships with the epiphyte species richness, but they had strong relationships with the moss cover. So the moss cover is actually mediating the climate effects in this system. Okay, let's look at the physiology of these plants and what that is telling us. So I do a lot of work with what we call functional traits. So you may have noticed that some plants look different from each other. Has anybody noticed that? Yeah, so these different plants have different characteristics, just like all of us have different characteristics from each other. Plants have traits as well. And when the trait is functional, it means that it confers an advantage to that plant to live there. Some traits may just be haphazard and not have any kind of a functional significance, but a lot of traits do have a functional significance, and they mean different things. So one of the most common functional trait things that we look at is called the leaf economic spectrum. And so this is actually a cluster of traits that relate to how adapted a plant is to live in high stress environments. So environments that have, little access to water, low nutrients, lots of sun or wind exposure are stressful environments, and plants have consistent adaptations around the world that help them to deal with stressful environments, including slow photosynthesis. They tend to have small, thick leaves, and they tend to function in ways where they're very conservative of how they use nutrients and water and very efficient at that use. On the other end of the spectrum, there are low stress environments where there's lots of abundant water and nutrients available. And this results in plants that grow large leaves. They're generally not well defended. The leaves may not last very long, but they can kick out a lot of photosynthesis, and they use a lot of nutrients and a lot of water. And so that's the leaf economic spectrum. So just like so we can think about functional traits in terms of how good something is at functioning in its environment. So if you're a short human, you may not be well adapted to an environment that has tall cupboards. And you might be more well adapted to a tight airplane space than a larger person. So these strategies occur in the environments where we would expect to find them related to the environmental conditions. And traits vary even within species. A specific trait will vary among individuals. And then there's also consistency comparing one species to another. So an individual is generally more like another individual of its same species and its traits than an individual of another species. And those traits those differences come both from evolutionary adaptation, so evolving these traits over evolutionary time to be best suited to the environments that they're in. But then there's also plasticity, which is responding in real time to environmental conditions. So if you transplant, so here's a good example that I've seen in my own household. So I have a lot of houseplants and we bring them outside in the summer. And the new leaves that they grow after they've been outside tend to be a lot smaller and kind of thicker than the leaves that they grew when they were inside and not getting enough light during the winter. And so that's an example of plasticity. Same plant responding to different environmental conditions will have different trait values. And these traits can be used to predict responses to the environment, both in terms of across geography where species are found, but then also how they might respond to future conditions, including conditions of climate change. So back to the leaf economic spectrum, I gathered trait data related to the leaf economic spectrum from plants in the coffee farms and in the forests at the two sites that were different in their climate, and compared how they where they fell along this leaf economic spectrum. So the first thing to note is that the gray dots are kind of worldwide plants. There's data set that's called LopNet that's used in a lot of analyses of traits. So in terms of comparison to other non-woody plants, epiphytes are very much on the slow end of this leaf economic spectrum, which is what we would probably expect, right? They're in very stressful environments in these outer branches of trees. They're water limited. They're probably nutrient limited in most cases. So it makes sense that they're falling at the slow end of that leaf economic spectrum. And bromeliads in particular seem to be doing some weird things that I'm still investigating. But we found that traits respond to the environmental gradients within these farms. So the humid site had plants that were less water use efficient than the drier site, and same thing moving from the forest to the coffee farm. Species that were more likely to be found in the forest had lower water use efficiency than species that were more likely to be found in the coffee farm. And then also there was even stronger trait relationships within a given tree. So moving from the trunk to the outer branches, you get increases in water use efficiency, you get plants with tougher leaves, higher nitrogen use efficiency, smaller leaves, and they're getting more of their nitrogen from atmospheric sources. So from atmospheric dust or from rainfall rather than from sources that are more related to where most plants that are rooted in the ground are getting their nutrients. Through this work, I noticed a few things about doing work on functional traits on these species. First of all, they're difficult to access. They're high up in trees. Trees have to be climbed individually. You don't always know that the species that you want is even up there when you start climbing. They can be hard to identify if they don't have reproductive material. A lot of these plants look pretty superficially similar when they're not in flower. And many of these species, especially the orchids, have low population density. They're rare species. So in order to get getting sufficient replication for scientific study is difficult. So I'm just gonna give you a peek into what I'm doing now related to functional traits and epiphytes. And so I had this idea while I was working on this, that we have all of these plants have been favorites of collectors for hundreds of years. They're housed in botanical gardens all over the world. Can we use those botanical garden plants as surrogates for wild plants in understanding these functional traits, and then use that to look at how these species might be expected to respond to climate change based on the traits that they have and the locations that they live currently. So what I'm doing is I'm visiting botanical gardens around the country that have large collections of epiphytes. I've worked at Missouri Botanical Garden, Atlanta Botanical Garden, the US Botanical Garden in DC, and Marie Selby Botanical Garden in Sarasota, Florida. So far, I've got a couple more that I'll be visiting, and I'm collecting leaf samples from these plants to look at what their traits and whether they're equivalent to the traits of those species that are found in the wild. And I'm essentially using this as a common garden experiment, these living collections at botanical gardens. These are plants that are from different places in the wild, but we've brought them all together and are growing them under the same environmental conditions. So what that does, and this is a common garden, is a common technique to separate genetics versus environmental influences in things like plant traits. And so we can see the evolutionary adaptation piece of the trait without necessarily seeing the plasticity piece. So that's the work that I'm doing now. We'll be looking at how traits vary along gradients across the landscape, but then also across the gradients that exist within an individual tree. All right, back to the coffee. So now I want to talk about the farmer piece of this puzzle. And I conducted interviews with 33 farmers in Nicaragua on coffee farms ranging from a couple of hectares all the way up to a couple thousand hectares. So a large variety of types of farmers, large variety of income levels, but all of them were growing coffee that had shade trees in it. So I wanted to understand what they liked about that system, why they had chosen to have trees in their system, and then how they managed those trees, because that has implications for how the epiphytes can live in the farm. And I actually divided the farmers into 6 different typologies, but just to simplify it here, the most stark differences are between the small farms and the large farms. So smallholder farmers, the area of the farm is small. They grow mostly or only coffee. Sometimes they also grow subsistence crops in addition to that, but coffee is pretty much their main commodity crop. They don't necessarily have any or very many outside economic income sources. And because of that, they tend to be locked in a cycle of debt and credit, where one of the interesting things about coffee, the not so great things if you're a coffee farmer, is you harvest once a year. Your income comes once a year. So when that income, that lump sum runs out, then they start borrowing against the next year's crop for their subsistence needs. And they get locked in this cycle of debt and credit, where 1 or 2 years of bad crop or crop failure could make them lose the farm. So they're in a very precarious situation economically. They don't have high levels of education, and they don't have a lot of access to people like extension agents that would help them implement better practices on their farms. They also don't have a lot of access to marketing options. So generally they're taking their coffee to the local market and selling it there rather than selling higher up on the supply chain. Their labor source is mostly from within the family, and they tend to use higher levels of agrochemicals because that's labor saving for them. Large farms have diversified land uses. They tend to have multiple income sources. Some of them had ecotourist operations. Some of them also had cattle ranching. Some of them had significant off-farm work by some of the members of the family. And those multiple income sources helped to buffer them against hard years. It also meant that they didn't have to take debt for their subsistence needs, they could take debt instead strategically to make infrastructure improvements to the farm that would allow them then to be able to grow more coffee or sell it for a higher price. They tended to be better educated. Some of the owners were, in fact, had degrees in agronomy. So they were putting their learning into practice on their farms, or they had, they knew people that had degrees in agronomy that were advising them. And many of them also had higher access to better markets. So they would sell directly to an exporting company rather than selling in the local market. Or some of them even had relationships with importers abroad that they would sell directly to someone in the United States, for example. And that allowed them to get a much higher price point for their coffee per kilo than the smallholder farmers. They also tended to hire workers, and labor is extremely cheap there. So they were less concerned about labor-intensive practices in a lot of cases. So the farms, particularly the ones that had ecotourist operations, were putting into place practices that were very labor-intensive, but also very environmentally friendly, because they had the labor resources to be able to do that, whereas the smallholders didn't. Across all of these farmers, I asked them about what they valued in having trees on their farms. And they identified a number of ecosystem services that trees perform for them. So those are things like provisioning services, where they have fruit coming from some of the trees that helps to support their subsistence needs. Some of them would, a lot of them, especially the smallholder farmers, collected firewood from pruning the shade trees in their farms. Pretty much all of the cooking in that region is still done on firewood. So that having that resource directly there on their farm and close to their house was really valuable to them. Some of them would, if they were building a new addition onto the house or a new piece of furniture, they would selectively cull one of their shade trees to provide the timber for that. So there were a lot of provisioning services that they found in the shade trees. They also recognized a number of regulating services, including better soil nutrition, because the shade trees would drop leaves that decomposed into the soil, and then they didn't need to do as much for fertilizing the coffee plants, because the trees were doing part of that work for them. And also regulating some of the water resources, so the soil would stay moister, and then also large rain events would be better absorbed in places where the shade trees were present. They also recognized cultural value of these trees. So some of the farmers talked about planting trees in their coffee farm for the first time, and then over the next few years watching the wildlife come back to their farms. So they would see birds and small mammals and things that they had never seen in their farms before. They also recognized a lot of cultural value in the epiphytes growing in the trees. They loved seeing the orchids flowering. Some of them had orchids that had fallen off the trees that they had brought home and had them growing in their home gardens. So there was a lot of appreciation for the natural environment. So some examples, some quotes that came out of this. For regulating services, I talked to a man who said there was a spring before on his property, but there were no trees, and I planted trees and the spring came back. It reverted and was better than before. The trees are helpful for life and for so many things, for all of humanity, it could be said. And then for the cultural services, one person said, for me, they're very beautiful plants. These are epiphytes. They give a great enhancement to the farm. You will see here on the farm how they are, and we plant them, we cultivate them. We like it like that because my wife is a lover of plants. We all are. They also recognize value in improved quality of the coffee. So a lot of farmers talked about how the shade trees affected the flavor and of the coffee and the quality of the bean, and how they could sell their coffee for a higher price because it was better quality when they had the shade trees. So one man said, if the beans take longer to mature, it picks up more of the nutrients and it has a better taste in the cup. Well, if it's exposed to the sun, it's stressed more. So the plants are more stressed when they're in full sun. And also somebody else said that the plants grow too fast, or the fruit matures too fast, and so then it doesn't develop its full flavor potential. They also recognize that there's climate change resilience in having trees in their farms. And I think this is really important. And I was kind of surprised when I heard this, but really happy. So this guy was an agronomist, and he was using he actually advised other coffee farmers in the region on how to improve their productivity. And then his own farm was his laboratory for experimenting. But he said the trees and coffee plantations help us to maintain a more homogeneous temperature within the plantation. We always see that it cushions the changes better, the climatic variability, when we have a number of trees in the coffee. They also talked about a few negative effects from having shade trees in the coffee. And the first of those was fungal diseases. So the coffee is very susceptible to a couple of different fungal diseases, and having the shade trees traps more of the humidity close to the coffee plants. So then the fungus is more likely to multiply. But they really saw this as a management issue, not as a true problem. They said the thing is, you have to manage the trees. You can't just plant them in the coffee and let them do whatever they will. So you do some management so that they both can live there, because we need the trees and we also need the coffee. And then they also saw negative effects from the moss growing on trees, especially when it would grow on the coffee plant. One man said, when there's moss that takes root all over, it squeezes the producing plant too much and it weakens the stem, and then it weakens the foliage in the case of coffee. So there were some negative effects associated with epiphytes as well. And overall, the decisions that they made on the farm were influenced by a kind of a complex suite of economics, where they were weighing the economic value of having trees on the farm versus the economic value of the coffee, and how those intertwined with each other. The labor supply available to implement different or new practices, the technical knowledge of what even those practices would be, and then the personal values of the farmers. So all of these pieces are at work in the decisions that they're making on their farms. And then to expand back up to the whole social ecological system, I think there are a few lessons that go across all of this. I don't know why it's not changing slides. We see some synergies. So the trees are providing benefits both to farmers and to the epiphytes. So there's synergies in this social ecological system where both interests are benefiting. But there's also some trade-offs. So especially at higher elevations where there tends to be cooler temperatures and higher humidity, that's when you get the most fungal disease problems, but it's also the most favorable habitat for the epiphytes. So in those situations, the farmers are trying to maximize how much they prune their trees, which minimizes the amount of habitat available for the epiphytes. So those are some trade-offs that exist in this system in terms of how we think about it for conservation. And then there are also some serious vulnerabilities of this system in terms of shade coffee existing on the landscape over the long term. So we saw how much more valuable large trees were for epiphytes than small trees. So those systems, the farming system needs to be in place for decades for those large trees to be able to reach their size and their kind of maximum conservation potential from an epiphyte perspective. So the long-term stability of the shade coffee practice is really important. But then on the human side, we saw how vulnerable that system is to crop failures and the economic system that a lot of these farmers are caught in. And so if they have a couple of years of crop failure, a lot of the smallholder farmers are pulling their land out of coffee and putting in something else that's going to be less environmentally friendly from every respect and probably have no value at all for epiphytes. But I think that also yields some opportunities that we wouldn't normally think of, just focusing on the biodiversity variable, if you will, of a system where we can, interventions are possible just purely directed at improving producer livelihood and getting them a higher price for their coffee that would indirectly allow for that persistence of the practice on the landscape and continue to provide all of these biodiversity benefits. So I think we can see this as a place to look for kind of unique or different kinds of conservation interventions or opportunities. So in conclusion, I think what I learned from this is that, evaluating the social and ecological components of the system together is really important because you see things that you might not see if you were only looking at one part of it. Also, that agricultural systems can make really actually impressive contributions to conservation in some cases, but there are a lot of pieces that have to line up right for that to happen. So thinking holistically about what all those pieces are and understanding how they can align and when they do align and when they don't can be really important in bringing agricultural systems into the conservation conversation. And then finally, that conservation in working landscapes like agriculture is not a replacement for parks and protected areas. It's a supplement to parks and protected areas. We need to continue to have pieces of land set aside for wild species, but we also need to find better ways, especially as the human population continues to increase and our pressure on ecosystems around the planet continues to increase, to find ways that people and wild species can coexist. I just have a few acknowledgements here. These are the folks that I worked with largely here at UW, and then my field assistant in Nicaragua. I had some undergraduate research assistants and a lot of funding that helped me out. And then my current project is funded by the National Science Foundation. I'm working in the lab of Dr. Kate McCullough here in the Botany department, and then I'm also working with a professor at Colgate University, Dr. Kat Cardeluz, and I have some amazing undergraduate researchers now too. So I would love to take any questions that you have.
Questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if I was in Wisconsin, if I was an acorn farmer, I'd be out of business here because I know if we had like no acorn. There's obviously some kind of long-term cycle that goes on.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, did you have to do like multi-year measurements on this stuff to look for things like kind of like the moose and the wolves up on Isle, where you kind of model the differential equation, but it's a multi-year cycle. Like multi-year cycles that are observable, or is this just human intervention and climate variability mask that too much?
So I think all of the epiphytes are perennials. So once they're established, they're there for a period of time. If I go in 1 year, I'm going to see the ones that have been living there. And if I go back the next year, that's going to be the same individuals. So I don't think there's a lot of interannual variation in this system. Although I don't know that for sure because nobody's really done what you just talked about. So that would be, and actually I'm planning on doing something similar to that in Florida with epiphytes that are growing in the Everglades and having a plot that I census repeatedly to see how the populations shift and change over time. Yes.
Can you talk about the role of coffee cooperatives and how they can help small farmers make big grown coffee farms successful?
Yeah, coffee cooperatives. So some of the smallholder farmers that I interviewed were part of cooperatives and some were not. So there was a sentiment among some of them that they didn't trust being part of a group think kind of a thing. They were very independent and they wanted to do it on their own. So I think that's one barrier potentially to cooperatives. Another issue, not so much associated directly with cooperatives, but is so certification is, so if you organic certification, there's coffee specific types of certification that look at environmental sustainability of practices. That's easier to get if you're in a cooperative. So the cooperative can bring a lot of people together, but the farmers don't necessarily understand the certifications very well. And I don't know that the cooperatives are doing a great job of making the case why they would want that, because there is a cost associated with getting certified and renewing your certification every year. So I'm not sure, at least in this region, I'm not sure how much the cooperatives are helping with that. They do help with the technical assistance piece. So the cooperatives do have agronomists, dedicated agronomists, to go out and talk to the farmers that are in the cooperative and give them new ideas. So that is an important function of the cooperatives. And then economically, I asked about whether the cooperatives gave them a higher price point than some. They said some years it does and some years it doesn't. So it's, I think that it's a great idea. And I think in some places it works really well. Like I know that there's a very famous cooperative in Honduras that has done amazing things for their members. There's what's the coffee company here in Madison that works with communities in Mexico. So they do, I forget which one it is, but they do direct buying from a community in Mexico, and basically also give them infrastructure improvements that can allow them to process their coffee better and have a higher quality coffee that will give them a higher price. So there are a lot of possible innovations for helping smallholder farmers through systems like that, I think that right now, at least in the region that I worked in, I would say that potential is largely unrealized.
How much alike are the environments in the coffee growing regions across the world? What you see in Nicaragua, do you see very alike things in, say, now, or is it quite different?
That's a hard question for me to answer because I haven't been to all of the coffee growing regions. I've been to Ethiopia, but I didn't see coffee farms when I was there. My understanding is that they're superficially similar. So shade coffee kind of looks superficially like shade coffee anywhere that you would go. There's the coffee in the understory. There's a system of varying complexity of shade trees in the overstory. In some places, there are not, epiphytes are not as present. Epiphyte biodiversity is extremely high in Central America. When you look at globally where epiphytes are distributed, so that may not be as much of a factor in somewhere like Ethiopia that has pretty low, pretty low diversity of epiphytes. I don't know about abundance. Yes.
These coffee farms use commercial fertilizers.
Yeah, a lot of them are. That was one of the labor saving, like herbicides and pesticides. Commercial fertilizers cost money, but they also save a lot of labor. So some of the larger farms were doing things like vermicomposting, worm composting. So they would take they would actually mill the coffee on site. So they had the waste product from the coffee that they would vermicompost and then use that to fertilize the plants. But that's a very labor intensive process. And it's very, you have to have a lot of technical knowledge about what you're doing to make that process actually work correctly for you. So I think the smallholders were more dependent on things like commercial fertilizers and chemicals. Yes.
In recent years, I've read about coffee plantation. That's a fungus that you mentioned, or is it another?
There's a few fungal diseases that are affecting coffee and also an insect. So the fungal disease that the farmers I talked to were mostly dealing with is called American leaf spot. I think it's but that is really, I think more so just in that region. I think the one you're thinking of is, oh, I just blanked on the name, coffee rust. Yeah. And then there's the coffee borer beetle is the insect it bores into the coffee bean and then reduces the value of the bean. So those are the major, what's that?
Goes right into the bean and not into the wood.
No, it goes into the bean, yeah. I don't know what it's getting out of there.
Yeah.
But the coffee rust devastated Nicaragua about 10 to 15 years ago. Complete crop failures across the whole country, I think for a couple of years in a row. And since then, it's kind of recovered. That's due to a combination of planting more resistant varieties of coffee, and then just understanding the cultural practices, the agricultural practices that would limit the spread of that disease the most. So it's still present. It's still affecting the coffee crop. The farmers I talked to said that it's actually more of a concern in hotter regions and lower elevations. So that could be something that we're seeing, unfortunately, expand with climate change as the farms in higher elevations get hotter. The disease will spread there.
Sandy online asking, do you have any plans to return to Nicaragua? Any cites the State Department's travel advisory?
Yeah, I don't have any plans to return to Nicaragua, as that travel advisory will tell you in April of 2018, which happened to be the last time I was there, there was a political uprising. And that has not really resolved itself since then. So I actually planned another field season in 2019, and the university did not allow me to go back. It was very interesting being there in 2018 when it all unfolded. But yeah, it's really unfortunate. So the president, now Daniel Ortega, he was one of the leaders of the revolution in the 80s, and started out as this really liberal, progressive, visionary kind of person, and as has happened in multiple cases around the world, then became an autocrat and is now being extremely repressive of dissent there, and kind of falsifying elections and all of the things. So that is all continuing to happen in Nicaragua.
How's that impacted the coffee trade with the rest of the world?
I don't think very much. Yeah, coffee is a major industry for them. So the the Ortega administration is not going to get in the way of that.
On this painting, you have
Yeah.
livestock, horses, cattle, pigs. But I didn't see any pictures of that before. What's the role?
So this was a painting that was on the side of one of the buildings at one of the farms I worked at that had an ecotourist operation. So they had, this is like their beautiful diversified farm where they have ecotourism and growing annual crops and cattle ranching and all of the different things coming together. So it's just, I guess, kind of their vision of what diversified agriculture looks like and how it coalesces with nature.
Cattle through the.
No, no, that would be adjacent, not. Although interestingly, especially people that are growing for their own subsistence, when coffee takes about 3 years of growth before it produces its first crop. So that's just wasted land for them during that time. So they'll plant rows of either corn or beans down in between the rows of coffee so they can get something for their subsistence needs in the time when that coffee is maturing. And it also casts a little shade on the coffee plants, so, and protects them from wind a little bit. So it's helpful both ways.
And how long does a coffee plant produce after that first 3 years? Once it starts kicking in, is it like grapevines and go on forever? Or
not really forever. So they'll go pretty good for about 10 years. And then what the farmers will do is just top the plant, cut it back to about this high of a stump, and then it'll resprout, and that will reinvigorate it, and it'll go for another 10 years or so.
And they have to pull it out.
Yeah, they pull it out eventually. Yeah. Yeah.
How's coffee propagated?
From seed. And usually the farmers will start the seeds themselves. In a lot of cases, they'll have a little nursery area. And I have a picture, I'm not going to be able to find it, but they have these little plastic bags that they put some soil in and put the bean in, and then the plants get about this big before they transplant them out into the ground.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Tell us more about Florida.
Oh, yeah. So I was down there 2 weeks after Ian hit, and it's really interesting the way that storm hit. It's very patchy. The destruction is very patchy. So you'll have, I stayed at, my friend has a mobile home down there.
Oh, good.
Her mobile home park was basically untouched. I mean, there were some branches that fell off trees and stuff, but all of the homes looked fine. And then you drive a mile or two up the road and there's another mobile home park that's flattened. So that's kind of how it is. And closer to the coast, there's a lot more destruction, but also there were a lot of low-lying areas that were farther in from the coast that got a lot of flooding, including some very poor neighborhoods that have not been talked about in the news as much as the rich people on the coast have been. You know, and I couldn't even go, the places that were the worst hit are still completely closed off. So Sanibel, Pine Island, Fort Myers Beach were the worst affected places where, you know, everything, a lot was destroyed completely. There's huge cleanup efforts going on, as you could imagine. There, like every fourth vehicle on the road is a contractor or a garbage removal service or something like that. So there's just tons of effort being poured in from resources from all over the country coming to help with the recovery effort. But it's going to be a long haul. It's going to be a long haul for them.
What did your new colleagues have to say?
Well, everyone's got stories. I think there's also a lot of, because of how patchy the destruction was, there's a lot of survivor guilt of people who they were totally fine. They did worse than the last hurricane, and their neighbors 3 blocks over had their home destroyed. So I heard a lot of those stories. A lot of concern about students that hadn't come back to class, students that hadn't responded to emails, students that called in tears asking for extensions on assignments and worrying about being able to finish the semester. Yeah. So I got a lot of concern for students, the faculty there.
What's the demographic?
A lot of first generation college students. They're almost 25% Hispanic student body, mostly from the local area. Yeah. And then also, I think it's on the flip side, it's an exciting time for ecological research. So everybody's like getting out as fast as they can in the field to collect samples and find out, document all of the effects of the hurricane. There's boats going out into the Gulf to take water samples and see how corals have fared, and people studying mangroves and people working on dune restoration. And so all of these, all of my colleagues there are actively engaged in doing hurricane research at the moment, which is very exciting in some ways.
Thank you for tuning us into the
Yeah.
situation there. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Thank you.